We all know about Ukraine's prolific campaign to burn Russia's entire energy sector to the ground. And it does not take a mathematician to calculate that the Kremlin is not a fan of refineries on fire. However, what has been less clear for the keyboard warriors who nonetheless expressed very strong opinions on the subject is the extent of the problem. Is this the type of thing that Putin views as the mere cost of doing business? Or is it the type of thing that will grind the Russian military to a halt? Or, alternatively, bring protesters out on the streets of Moscow to demand Putin's resignation? Well, rather than engaging in idle speculation, we now have some hard estimates from the professionals, which we can now use to engage in some slightly better informed speculation. So if you are ready to find out whether Putin is done, it is time to get out our calculators and start doing some super captivating math. Quick background. This information comes from that New York Times article that we discussed in depth what feels like a month ago, but has actually been about 10 days. Thanks, 2026. Point is, I have already shared this statistic, but we basically just marveled at the number rather than digging into the consequences. So here goes. The key number that the CIA estimated is $75 million per day. $75 million per day is what Ukraine's refinery campaign is costing the Kremlin. That works out to $27.4 billion per year. Now, I do not know about you, but I have never lost $75 million in a day, never mind $27.4 billion in a year. If I ever did, I imagine that I would be very sad. I also suspect that if I had that much money to lose in the first place, it is because the world has gone completely to hell, and my audience has expanded to half of the world's population, which, come to think of it, at that point may only be a few million people. So maybe it is not the worst thing that I have never lost that much money. Still, the problem with numbers like that is how state-level expenses are always unfathomably large, so it is hard to get a sense of whether $27.4 billion per year is actually meaningful. Well, as an unreasonably optimistic starting point, it is tempting to compare that to the Russian defense budget. So let's try that for a minute and see where it takes us. Now, it is hard to track how all of this converts to dollars, but that defense budget might be about $200 billion. Thus, according to the CIA, the refinery campaign is depriving Russia of about 13.7% of its war budget. For a single component of Ukraine's strategy, that is an absolutely absurd amount of damage. It also shows you just what is possible when you combine US intelligence with Ukraine's fine ability to not care at all about Russian escalation threats. Now, to see this for later, I just made a huge leap in logic and assumed that we deducted all $27.4 billion from the war budget, whereas the CIA estimate is that the campaign is costing the Russian economy as a whole that amount. In turn, that would mean that the Russian public as a whole is incurring some portion of the cost. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You see, it is not hard to find a set of war commentators who would look at these numbers and cue the "Putin is done" claims. If we could come back down to earth for a second, even using optimistic dollar figures does not get us there. You have certainly noticed that the territorial exchange numbers fluctuate on a monthly basis. 300 square kilometers for Russia last month, a bit over 600 the month before, back down to 400 the month before that. You get the idea. Oftentimes, we point to structural factors like the weather as what drives these figures, which they indeed do to some extent. Snow is worse than dry conditions. Rain is bad for vehicles, but increasingly helpful for cover from drones. The literal fog of war beats everything at this point. Nonetheless, one of the interesting aspects of Russia's years-long offensive is that casualty rates roughly track with the territory gained. Put differently, it seems that Russia is gaining ground proportional to the price that it pays, with the structural factors perhaps dictating the timing. We are not looking at cases where Russia finds a huge hole in Ukraine's defenses and then takes ground cleanly, like what has been the hallmark of Ukraine's various offensives. Instead, this has been one long attritional battle, with the variation in quantity of attrition. In turn, if Russia suddenly lost a seventh of its military budget, we would not see the offensive fall apart. Rather, Russia would have to adopt a slower pace, skipping every seventh opportunity to reconstitute its forces for the next round. Thus, we would certainly see these numbers tick down. But keep in mind that we already observe variations greater than 14% on a monthly basis, and it is hard to separate the signal from the noise there. In other words, if Russia held back a seventh of its effort, you would not immediately be able to spot it. It is still happening, and it is still good for Ukraine, but it is still easy for the effect to fly under the radar. To be clear, I am assuming a linear effect here. It is possible that cuts would result in exponential benefits for Ukraine, but I would be skeptical of that when the baseline figure is $200 billion. There is a lot of cushion for Russia to absorb the impact. So, it is worth repeating that the refinery campaign is having a major effect on the war. In fact, I am struggling to think of any relatively simple adjustment having a larger impact on the war. But the refinery campaign by itself is not a game ender. Putin is not done because of it. It is more like a shift of the line east rather than the outright erasing of it. From here, there are a couple of directions that we can take this video. One way is to look at the refinery campaign in the context of other financial problems that the Kremlin is running into. The other is to more closely interrogate Russia's budget allocation decision and learn some more general lessons about politics and the war economy. People tend to like good news, my audience is English-speaking, and the Kremlin's other financial woes are easier to cover, so let's begin there. Ukraine has not only been hitting refineries, of course. There has also been plenty of action at export terminals, and increasingly to the Shadow Fleet itself. We do not have the CIA's reports on those figures, so I do not want to speculate further on actual numbers, given that this video is intended to minimize speculation. Generally, though, this is trending things further in Ukraine's favor. We should also consider how this fits into the broader web of the world at war. The United States is fully committed to not permitting the Shadow Fleet to operate around Venezuela, and will chase tankers all the way to Iceland, even if they claim to be under a Russian flag. This ought to allay some fears that Russia will soon be flush with shadow tankers, though the United States is still a long way from seizing any ship sailing directly out of Russia, and Ukraine may want to continue considering further attacks on the export terminals. Excess tankers are irrelevant if there is nowhere for them to fill up. On the other hand, in the last few days, Germany denied entry to a Shadow Fleet tanker, and thus prevented it from entering the Baltic. The ship had to sail all the way up to the Russian Arctic instead. Now, it is hard to imagine Europe cracking down in the same zero-tolerance manner as the United States in Venezuela. It is the joy of only one of those countries having nuclear weapons. But if Europe started to get very particular about inconveniencing every questionable tanker coming through about their insurance, registration, cargo, and the like, then it would further counteract the increased availability of Shadow Fleet ships. Regardless, the biggest thing to sink Russia is sagging oil prices. Gray market oil is sold at a discount pegged to the standard market price, and it has been dropping. The macroeconomic factors for that, say concerns about a recession, are not important here. They are important overall, of course, but they are a few steps removed from the global conflict map. What is worth noting is that the special Maduro operation in Venezuela hardly moved oil prices. The unrest in Iran has, however. Simultaneously, reports are trending toward the protests having calmed down, but that the United States is moving a carrier strike group to the region. So hold further thoughts on that for a week. Also, further note that the Iran situation has only shifted oil prices by about $1. That is the world that we live in now that the US is a net exporter. One last comment here. It remains true that Russia is continuing to dig deeper into its pool of recruits. That means having to spend more to convince previously unwilling citizens to sign a military contract. That will forever trend the wrong way for Russia until the war ends, which means Russia needs every last one of those rubles even more. Now we need to rewind to understand why the 13.7% military budget reduction was a best-case scenario. We got there by calculating $27.4 billion in damages against a $200 billion defense budget. Do you see the hidden assumption there? We assumed that the Kremlin would exclusively subtract lost refinery receipts from the defense budget rather than from social spending. The 2025 budget overall was about $500 billion. If we instead assume that the Kremlin would deduct proportionally from both, military spending is 40% of the budget, so only about $11 billion comes out of it. That is only 5.5% of a reduction. Still massive for what the refinery campaign is, but definitely not enough to collapse Russia's military capacity. Another way to think of this is that it moves the expected outcome line a bit, but it has a disproportionate effect on Russia's costs of war. From a crisis bargaining perspective, the net effect is the same, so this is not as much of a criticism as it seems. Just looking at the top-line $27.4 billion figure actually tells you what you need to know. Of course, there are a couple of ways for the Kremlin to mitigate this problem. One is to draw further from the Fortress Russia accounts, though the liquid portion of that rainy day fund might not last past 2026. Alternatively, Russia could take out loans. This is easier said than done because Russia does not have access to Western creditors. Moreover, any rational lender would look at the Kremlin, realize that it is not a portrait of stability, and therefore demand a high interest rate. They may also wish to denominate that debt in dollars, as the ruble only adds to the instability. One thing that ought to be noted here is the role of China. For the just described reason, China has lacked the incentive to be a major creditor to Russia. Still, Beijing has done everything that it can to profit from the war, from buying cheap oil to subsidizing its drone manufacturing industry. If the situation ever became critical for the Kremlin, you might see Beijing step in as a lender of last resort. Effectively, China would be offsetting the long-term risk by profiting now from the ongoing fight. Then there is the problem that the federal budget is not Russia's entire war budget. Throughout the conflict, the Kremlin has used payments from regional governments to recruit soldiers as an intentional way to hide the true cost of war. As a result, I cannot stand here today and tell you that $200 billion is accurate. It is more. I just cannot tell you how much more. We also need to circle back to how the damage is to the Russian economy as a whole, and not exclusively coming from the Kremlin's coffers. This is more of a mixed bag. On one hand, it means that the other parties are actually internalizing the losses. That includes energy oligarchs as well as Russian citizens having to navigate a fuel crisis. This puts more political pressure on Putin. But whether that is better or worse than the alternative is unclear. If you think that the Kremlin offers just enough to keep both pairs of domestic opponents at bay, then the cash ultimately comes out of the military expenditures via an increase to social spending and political payoffs. The point is, again, to treat that 13.7% budget cut as the optimistic case. Finally, a word of warning for the Western coalition. That $75 million per day rests on the fact that someone at the CIA discovered that Russia cannot easily reproduce one particular part of the refineries. That is how Ukraine can hit a facility once and have it stay down for an extended period. But if you keep hitting the same thing, and Russia keeps having to repair it, eventually they will figure out how to streamline that process. The $75 million per day is liable to shrink. Not to worry for those in the West, there is always another weakness to exploit. Hey, 2.8% of my American audience hails from Virginia. For those of you in Langley, may I suggest getting back to work? Alternatively, you could pick up one of these two excellent books about the war. Check the video description for more information on them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care.